Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much for coming. Hopefully you are looking forward to this event. We're very, very lucky to have Bill Browder here this evening. Browder is a hedge fund manager, former CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, and famously, at one point, the largest foreign investor in Russia. After his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was murdered in Russia, he became a virulent anti-corruption campaigner and is here to tell his story. Bill.
Throw this here.
Yeah.
Hello, and welcome. I'm very happy to be here at the Cambridge Union to tell my story. If you were to ask any one of my friends to describe me in one sentence, the one sentence they would probably use is that I'm Vladimir Putin's #1 enemy. Now that sounds very dramatic, self-important, perhaps exaggerated, but when you're done hearing what I'm going to tell you today, you won't doubt that that's the case. So how is it that this guy with an American accent ended up becoming Putin's #1 enemy? Let me tell you my story from the very beginning. So I am indeed from America. I was born in Princeton, New Jersey, brought up in Chicago, but I come from a very unusual American family. My grandfather, Earl Browder, was a labor union organizer from Wichita, Kansas in the 1920s. And he was so good at organizing the union that he was spotted by the communists, and they said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come to Russia and check it out? So my grandfather went to Russia. He got there and he did what every young red-blooded American young man does when he gets to Russia. He found a Russian girl who became my grandmother. My father was then born in Moscow. And 5 years later, my grandfather returned to the United States and became head of the American Communist Party. He ran for president on the communist ticket against Roosevelt in 1936 and 1940. He was imprisoned by Roosevelt in 1941, pardoned in 1942. He was then expelled from the Communist Party in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist. And then he was persecuted viciously in the 1950s for being a communist. So this is my family legacy. I was born in 1964. I'm 53 years old. When I was going through my teenage rebellion in the 1970s, I was trying to figure out the best way of rebelling from this family of communists. And I tried several things. I grew my hair long. You can't really tell right now, but it grew into an afro. But strangely, that didn't upset my family. I followed the Grateful Dead around America for 3 months, and that also didn't upset my family. But then I came up with the perfect way to upset my family, which was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. And that did. I became a capitalist. I went to Stanford Business School, and I graduated business school in 1989, which was a very auspicious year because that was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was trying to figure out what to do with my career, one day I had this epiphany, which is that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And that's what I set out to do. So I moved. I couldn't get as far as Eastern Europe. I got as far as London, and I started working in London on anything Eastern Europe that I could get involved in. And I ended up in 1992 working at the investment bank, the U.S. investment bank called Salomon Brothers, which doesn't exist today. It's a famous American investment bank which was immortalized in a book called Liar's Poker written by Michael Lewis, which I recommend you read if you haven't. And I went to work at Salomon Brothers as an investment banker on the East European investment banking team. And my very first assignment at Salomon was to go and advise the management of a fishing fleet located in Murmansk, Russia, on their privatization. For those of you who don't know the geography of Russia, Murmansk is the furthest north population center in the world, located 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. So I fly to Murmansk. I met at the airport by the head of the fishing fleet. He takes me down to the docks so he can show me one of the vessels that make up this fleet. And we park the car, and I look out at this enormous ship. It's about 300 feet long. It's on a number of different stories. On the top story, they have the nets where they catch the fish. Then they take the fish and everything else and put it into a chute. In the next story, they separate out the fish from all the other things. It goes down another chute. And the next story, they have a bunch of machines which they use to can the fish. And so effectively, this was an ocean-going fishing factory. I asked him how much. It was very impressive. I said, how much does one of these things cost? And he said, $20 million. I said, how many do you have in your fleet? He said, 100. So I multiplied 20 million times 100, and that gets you to $2 billion. And I said, what is the age of the fleet? And he said, it's about 7 years old. And I didn't know much about fishing and ships, and I still don't, but I figured 7 years old maybe made it half depreciated. So $1 billion worth of ships. And I had been hired by the management of this fishing fleet to advise them on whether to exercise their legitimate right under the privatization program of Russia to buy 51% of this company. And so I asked him, at what price is the government selling 51%? And he said, $2.5 million. So let me just repeat the math. There's $1 billion worth of ships, and you can buy 51% for $2.5 million. You don't have to be some type of financial genius to know that that's a good deal. And so I thought to myself, if this is this something that's just specific to this company, or is this a fishing issue, or is this something that's going on more widespread? And so I decided, instead of going back to London, I was going to go to Moscow and figure it out. So I get a flight from Murmansk to Moscow, and I should point out that I don't know a single word of Russian, and other than the head of the fishing fleet, I don't know any people in Russia. And so I arrive at Sheremetyevo Airport. I'm wandering through the airport, and I notice there's a kiosk. And at the kiosk, they're selling a very thin English language yellow page directory. And so I buy this English language yellow page directory. I go to the Metropole Hotel on Red Square. The next morning, I wake up and I start cold calling people in the yellow page directory to see if they can explain to me the Russian privatization program. After 1 week, I had 40 meetings, and after those 40 meetings, I determined that the Russian privatization program in 1992 was and always will be the single most compelling investment opportunity that's ever existed in the history of financial markets. What they were doing was, in order to go from communism to capitalism, the Russian government made a huge sweeping decision, which was to give away all state property away for free to the people to create a country full of capitalists. And they did this through a number of different privatization programs. The one that I discovered in Moscow was something called the voucher privatization program. And the voucher privatization program was very simple. They gave a physical certificate called a voucher to every person in the country. So there's 150 million of people in the country. And these vouchers were freely tradable. You could buy them, you could sell them, you could swap them, you could burn them, you could do anything you wanted with them. And so that a secondary market developed in the vouchers for about $20 each. And so, again, if you did the math, 150 million times $20 gets you $3 billion worth of vouchers. And those $3 billion worth of vouchers were exchangeable for 30% of the share capital of all Russian companies. And what that meant was that the entire value of Russia, the value of the country, was $10 billion in 1992. And let me just put this into some perspective for you. Russia is a country with 35% of the world's natural gas, 10% of the world's oil, 10% of the world's aluminum, 10% of the world's steel. There's fertilizer, there's car companies, there's telephone companies, electricity companies, banks, you name it. The entire country, altogether, was worth $10 billion. You could not buy a mid-sized oil company in Oklahoma for $10 billion. You could buy the entire country of Russia in 1992 for $10 billion. And so I went back to Salomon Brothers with just the widest eyes. They were giving money away for free in Russia. And I went to the first person I saw at Salomon Brothers, and I said, we've got to stop everything we're doing and invest in Russia. Now imagine, this was a long time ago, but that was not a very compelling pitch to start a discussion about investing in Russia. I didn't even have a chance to get to the numbers I've just shared with you. People just shut down when they heard me say that, and I didn't have any great organizational political skills. And so if one person sort of snubbed me, I would just go to the next person. And so I went from person to person to person with that same pitch. And by the time I was done, I'd completely and absolutely discredited myself inside Salomon Brothers. And Salomon Brothers was not a normal company. It was the most dog-eat-dog firm out there. If you didn't earn for the company 5 times what they were paying you in salary, you were fired. And it was not the kind of place that... So not only was I not earning 5 times what they were paying me, but I was this crazy guy talking about Russia. And so it was almost for sure I was going to be fired. And I was very upset about this because I had come up with something which was just so clear and so amazing, and I wasn't going to have any opportunity to exercise my good idea. And I was getting more and more upset and more frustrated and more just despondent. And I was sitting there trying to figure out what I was going to do after I was fired, and one day the phone rings, and it's a very senior person from the New York office of Salomon Brothers. And he calls up, and he said, Bill, I hear you're having a bit of career trouble, but you might have something interesting to say about Russia. Can you come to New York and explain it to me? So I said, yes, of course. I set up a meeting for a week later. I then stayed up 3 nights in a row writing the most powerful and persuasive PowerPoint presentation you could ever imagine. I then rehearsed it on the airplane, rehearsed it in front of the mirror in my hotel room, went in to have a meeting, and I started going through the presentation. And I'm going through the presentation, and the guy is not giving me any feedback. He's not nodding, he's not uh-hing, he's not asking any questions, he's just staring at me impassively as I'm going through these slides. And I get to slide 21, and without a word, he gets up and leaves the room. And I'm thinking to myself, what have I done wrong? This is the most important meeting of my life. I had rehearsed it, I had thought about it, I thought I'd got it perfect, and the guy just leaves. And he's gone for 10 minutes, and I'm thinking to myself, I've got to turn this thing around because this is my one chance to save my career. He's gone for 20 minutes. I'm getting more and more agitated. I'm gonna come up with something. 30 minutes, 40 minutes. 52 minutes later, this guy comes back, and I'm ready to blurt out something to try to get this meeting back on track. But before I have a chance to say a single word, he said, Bill, those 21 pages you showed me are the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my investment life. I've just gone to the risk management committee of Salomon Brothers, and I've got you $25 million to invest in this stuff. Stop everything else you're doing. Go to Russia. Get the money invested. It's like the biggest cloud lifted off my shoulders. I just couldn't have been more relieved. I go to Russia, get the money invested, and then 7 months later, The Economist writes an article called Sale of the Century, in which they just repeat the math that I've just shared with you. And a bunch of people read that article in the West, and about 20 big Western investors decided that it made sense to invest in Russia. And so they all showed up at once to try to invest their money in Russia. And the Russian stock market was a very thinly traded, illiquid, inefficient stock market. And the moment that these 20 sort of barreling investors showed up there, it did one thing, which is the Russian stock market over a 3-week period went up 5 times. And so my $25 million portfolio in the summer of 1994 turned into $125 million. And this is back in the days when $100 million was real money. And so all of a sudden I was a hero on the trading floor of Salomon Brothers. All the people who had been snubbing me were all there at my desk when I arrived, waiting for me impatiently so they could get their investment advice on how to make 5 times their money in the Russian stock market. And then after a little while, some older people started coming by my desk, these sort of distinguished-looking characters. And one of them came up to me and said, "Hi, Bill, you don't know me, but I'm the guy who covers the George Soros account. And I know you're extremely busy and you've got a lot of important things going on, but is there any way you could spare a little time for George? He'd really be very grateful." And then a guy came around from Sir John Templeton, who's like the dean of investment. He said, I covered Sir John Templeton. He'd really be so grateful if you could come to the Bahamas and spend a little time with him, tell him about Russia. And then Julian Robertson and Michael Steinhardt and Edmund Safra. This was like the royalty of Wall Street. And every one of these people wanted to meet me. So I went on a world tour of the royalty of Wall Street. And these people were much smarter than my colleagues at Salomon Brothers. And within minutes, they said, "This is unbelievable. Can we give you some money to manage?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. This is not something we do. We manage our own money. But let me go back and ask the bosses." So I go to the guy who's head of the trading floor, and I say, "I've just been with George Soros. He'd like us to manage his money. What do you think?" And he said, "Bill, great idea. Let's form a task force to study it." So I said, "Okay." So a week later, the first task force meeting happens, and I walk into this room. It's a medium-sized conference room, and there are 45 people in the room. 40 of them I've never seen before in my life. There was the vice chairman of the firm, senior managing directors, senior directors, directors, senior vice presidents, and me. So I'm in this room, everybody piles in, they crowd into this enormous table, and as soon as the conversation starts, a fight breaks out as to who's going to get the economic credit for the business. And there's all these different groups within the investment bank, and the one thing I can tell you about investment bankers is that they're incredibly good at making arguments for why they are entitled to money that they don't deserve. And so these people started making these incredibly great arguments about why the fixed income group should get the money, and why the emerging markets group, and why the asset management, all these different groups all wanted the money, and it's so persuasive, and I had absolutely no idea who was going to win the argument. But I was 100% sure who wasn't going to get any economic credit for the business, and that was going to be me. And I was the only person in the whole room who had even been to Russia, and I was so upset that these people were all going to do this to me and not give me any credit, that after about 3 days, I had enough. I brought my security card in, I put it on the desk of the guy at the head of the trading floor. I resigned. I said, "I'm going to set up my own investment fund." He said, "Oh, don't do that, Bill, you're going to fail." I said, "I don't care." I left. I moved to Moscow. I got $25 million from Edmund Safra, one of the guys I met on this world tour of royalty of Wall Street. I started my fund in Moscow, April 1996. And it was the most successful launch of an investment fund in the history of investment funds. Over the next 18 months, my fund went up 850%. It was the best performing fund fund in the world in 1997. My Business Week, the New York Times, all sorts of newspapers were writing about how I was some kind of financial genius. My clients were sending their private jets to pick me up in Moscow, to take me to the south of France to celebrate my success on their yachts. and I was all of 31 years old. Now, any of these great accomplishments are great accomplishments in their own right. But if you put them all together into the hands of a 31-year-old, that is the biggest sell signal there ever was. But I was 31 years old, and so I didn't see the sell signal. So I'm 31 years old. At this point, I'm managing $1 billion. I think it's going to turn into $10 billion. And then all of a sudden, in the summer of 1998, Russia has one of the most extreme financial crises they've ever had. They defaulted on their bonds. They devalued their currency by 75%. And my $1 billion of assets goes down 90%. I lost $900 million for my clients. Now, as great as it felt on the way up, it felt even worse on the way down. And most shockingly for me was that I had gone around the world telling everybody, proselytizing about how great it would be for everyone to invest in Russia and how much money I was going to make for everybody, and I lost them 90% of their money. I was deeply ashamed, deeply upset, and determined to get their money back. And in theory, it shouldn't have been that hard to get their money back because I invested mostly in oil companies, and the oil companies sold their oil in dollars, but they paid all their costs in rubles, and the ruble price had just gone down by 75%. And so, in theory, if the sales stay the same and the costs go down, then the profits explode. And so I thought, if I just hold on to my stocks, then the profits will explode, the share price will go up, I'll get everyone's money back, and this humiliation will be over. In theory, that's what should have happened, except that these companies were all majority share held or owned by the Russian oligarchs. Now, Russian oligarchs are not nice people in the best of times. These are people who got to where they were by breaking every rule. And the only thing that kept them from not stealing from their minority shareholders in this period leading up to that was that these fancy guys from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley would come in their suits and their Hermes ties to Moscow and say, "We can get you some free money on Wall Street." And the oligarchs said, "Yeah, we like that." And then the bankers would say, "But just one thing, you cannot scandalize your investors. You cannot rip them off." This was kind of a tough one, but the oligarchs said, okay, we can steal from them later. And so the oligarchs kind of held themselves together, didn't steal anything up until 1998. But then all of a sudden, the market crashes, everything's down 90%, devaluation, default. And when they called up their fancy bankers at Goldman Sachs and said, "Hey, can you get him? I need some of that money now." The banker said, "Who? I'm sorry, I don't know you." And they put the phone down because no banker wanted to admit they had anything to do with Russia. And the oligarchs, when they realized that the bankers were no longer taking their calls, they said, "Well, wait a second. If there's no more of that free money, then why in the world would we ever do something so stupid as not steal from our investors?" The incentive had just disappeared entirely, and there's never been any disincentive for oligarchs to do anything bad. And so any self-respecting Russian oligarch decided to steal whatever they could. And these oligarchs embarked on an orgy of stealing, which has been unprecedented in the history of business. They did transfer pricing, embezzlements, dilution, asset stripping, and they did it to a fine art on an industrial scale. And there I was with my last 10 cents on the dollar, trying to climb out of this hole, and they were going to steal it from me. And so not as a good investment strategy, but as a survival strategy, I became a shareholder activist in Russia. And the most famous shareholder activism case that I was involved in was Gazprom. Gazprom is the largest company in Russia, and at the time, Gazprom was trading at a 99.7% discount to Exxon and BP per barrel of hydrocarbon reserves. Now, why was it trading at such a big discount? Because everybody thought that every last cubic meter of gas had been stolen out of the company. And so I decided to do something which had never been done before, which is a stealing analysis of Gazprom. Well, how do you do a stealing analysis? You can't go to the management of the company and say, "Excuse me, sir, can you tell me how much you're stealing?" Because that would not get you very far. And nor could you go to the investment banks who covered Gazprom, because they were so busy trying to get any kind of fee business from the company, the last thing they would do is say anything bad or anything truthful about Gazprom. So I decided to do something which had never been done before, which was I made a list of all the people I thought knew about the stealing, ex-employees, customers, competitors, etc., and I asked them out to breakfast, lunch, dinner, tea, coffee, dessert, without telling them my agenda in advance. And about 35 of the 40 people I asked out thought it was kind of a curious thing. What's this guy want from me? Sure, I'll have a meal, see what he has to say. We go and have these meals. And in my first meeting, I sit down with this competitor at an Italian restaurant, this competitor Gazprom, and I sit at this Italian restaurant and I say, "Can you tell me about the stealing?" And at that moment, I discovered the most interesting cultural anomaly of Russia, which is that during the Soviet times, the richest person in Russia was 6 times richer than the poorest person. They might have had a dacha, a bigger apartment, maybe a driver, but not too much. By 1999, the richest person in Russia was 250,000 times richer than the poorest person in Russia. And this happened over a 10-year period. And it poisoned the psychology of the entire country. And so when I sat down at that first lunch and I asked this guy, "Can you tell me about the stealing?" He leaned forward and he started launching into the most outrageous stories of stealing I could have ever imagined. And I had a notebook and I started taking notes and flipping it over and taking more notes, and he kept on going on and on and on and on. 2 hours later, he was still talking. I had to leave because I had another meeting. He could have gone on all afternoon. My next meeting was exactly the same, and so was the meeting after that. And by the end of these meetings, I had filled up 2 full notebooks with the most unbelievable, outrageous stories of stealing you could ever imagine. And I knew I was onto something gigantic. The problem was that I had no idea if any of it was true. These were all just rumors over lunch. It could have been misinformation, disinformation, exaggeration, sour grapes, anything. And it was very frustrating. I couldn't go to the press with it because it's just lunchtime conversations. I couldn't go to the court with it. But I wanted to do something with it, and I was just getting more and more frustrated, and there was clearly something there, but I didn't know what to do. And then, all of a sudden, we had the most unbelievable lucky break. My head of research was at Pushkin Square, which is a place where the traffic completely stops in Moscow. Because the traffic completely stops, there's an outdoor market that's emerged where street urchins sell stuff to the people stuck in their cars. And because of that, there's all sorts of weird stuff being sold. There's pornographic DVDs, pirated cigarettes, newspapers, underwear, all sorts of strange stuff. So my head of research, Vadim, is at the traffic light, stuck there, and some kid comes to his car and he knocks on the window. Vadim rolls it down, and he says to the kid, "What do you got?" And the kid says, "Databases." Vadim said, "What do you mean databases?" And so he has this dirty down parka. He opens it up, and there's a bunch of clear plastic folders and disks in each folder. And Vadim points towards one of the disks, and he says, "What's that one?" And the kid said, "That's the Moscow Registration Chamber database. And this is something we had been looking for. This is the place that shows the beneficial ownership of all Moscow-based companies." And Vadim, he's kind of perked up and said, "Really? Okay, how much?" And the kid said, $5. So Vadim hands him the $5. He takes the disk. He comes to the office and he waves this disk and he said, "I've just bought the Moscow Registration Chamber database for $5 from a kid at Pushkin Square." And I said to Vadim, "You've been ripped off." He said, "Let's see." And this is back before the days of computer viruses. And so we took the disk, put it into the computer. And sure enough, it was the Moscow Registration Chamber database, all bells and whistles. And the most interesting thing was that when we popped the disk out, there was a phone number on the disk to call for other databases. And so they had the Federal Securities Commission database, there was the Customs Committee database, all sorts of other databases. And sure enough, Vadim did get ripped off because the other databases cost $1. But from all these databases, we were then able to combine that with all these notes that I'd taken in all these meetings, and we were able to conclude definitively what had been taken out of Gazprom. And what had been taken out of Gazprom was the most unbelievable economic statistic I've ever seen in my entire life. Between 1996 and 1999, the management of Gazprom had stolen oil and gas reserves equal to the size of Kuwait out of the company. Now, if you'll remember, there was a war fought over oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait in Kuwait. It was called the First Gulf War. I've just discovered a similar magnitude crime has just been committed, and nobody knew. So that's the first most important economic statistic I've ever come across in my life. The second most important economic statistic was in the same scenario here, and that is that oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait only represented 9.65% of total reserves. In other words, more than 90% of Gazprom had not been stolen. Now remember, the company was trading at a 99.7% discount because the market thought everything had been stolen. I've just discovered, with good analysis and good proof, that more than 90% hadn't been stolen. Now, when you're in the world of finance, this is what you look for. If you could ever find something like this is nirvana, where people have come up with such a misinformation or such a misimpression over what's happened that the market completely misunderstands something. And in a situation like this, to use a highly technical financial term, we backed up the truck and bought as much Gazprom as we could possibly get our hands on. So at this point, we buy all the Gazprom we could possibly get. It became my single largest investment. And this is normally where you stop as an investor. You make your investment, you do your analysis, you figure out all this stuff, and then you wait for the world to figure out after you. But I was too impatient to wait for the world to figure it out. I wanted to figure out faster. And so I took our dossier and I broke it into 7 chapters. I shared the first chapter with the Wall Street Journal, second chapter with the Financial Times, third chapter with Business Week, Washington Post, etc. Each of them wrote stories. On the back of their stories, the Russian press wrote stories. On the back of their stories, the Russian State Duma, their parliament, began debates about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for these assets to be stolen from Gazprom. More stories. As a result of those debates, the management of Gazprom hired PricewaterhouseCoopers to do a report to say it was a good thing to steal these assets. More stories. In total, there were 500 stories written about theft at Gazprom. And then the strangest thing happened. At the annual general meeting of the next year, in June, Vladimir Putin, who has newly become the president of Russia, stepped into the fray and fired the guy who did the CEO who did all the stealing at Gazprom. He fired the CEO who did the stealing and replaced him with a new guy whose job it was not to steal assets of Gazprom. I stress the word assets. He's allowed to steal some other things. But just making the announcement that he wasn't going to steal any assets from Gazprom, the share price jumped 138% the next day. And then the share price doubled again after that. It then doubled again after that. It then doubled again, and then it doubled again, and then it doubled again. And then it doubled again, and then it doubled again. The share price of Gazprom went up 100 times. 100 times. This was not some micro-cap company. This was the largest company in the country, my largest investment, and it went up 100 times. Now, as you can imagine, I felt pretty good about myself. And I thought to myself, wait a second, if we can do this at Gazprom, let's do it at the electricity company. Let's do it at the National Savings Bank. Let's do it at the oil companies. And so I embarked on this campaign of naming and shaming corruption in these companies. And I did it at a very strange moment in political history of Russia, which was the moment that Putin had come to power. And Putin had the same problem I had. The oligarchs were stealing power from him at the same time as they were stealing money from me. I've never met Vladimir Putin. I've never had a conversation with Vladimir Putin. But because we have this strange alignment of interests, every time I would put one of these exposés out there, either he or his government would step in on my side of the fight. And because of that, my portfolio from 1999, when it was $100 million, having gone down from $1 billion, went from $100 million to $4.5 billion. I became the largest foreign investor in Russia. And I had the best job in the world because I was not only making money, but I was doing good in the same job. And it's very rare that you can have a job where you can make money and do good. You can either make money and not do good, or do good and not make any money. But I could do both, and boy, was that great. But it wasn't going to last forever. So Vladimir Putin was supporting my fights up until a certain moment. And that moment was the end of 2003. At the end of 2003, Vladimir Putin decided that he was going to go for broke and win his war with the oligarchs. And the way he went about doing that was to arrest the richest oligarch in Russia, a man named Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos oil company. He was worth $15 billion. He arrested him off of his jet in Siberia, brought him back to Moscow, put him on trial, and allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. Now imagine you're the 17th richest person in Russia. You see the richest person, a person far better, far smarter than you, sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction going to be? You don't want to sit in that cage. And so one by one, the oligarchs went to Putin in the fall of 2004 and said, Vladimir, what do we have to do so we don't have to sit in a cage? And he said, it's real simple. 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government, not 50% for the presidential administration of Russia, 50% for Vladimir Putin. And at that moment in time, Putin became the richest man in the world, and all of a sudden, all of my naming and shaming campaigns were no longer against his enemies, but they were against his own 50% financial interest. And it didn't take them very long to figure out what to do with me. And in November 13th, 2005, as I was flying back from London to Moscow after having lived there for 10 years and was the largest foreign investor in their country, I was stopped at Sheremetyevo Airport. I was arrested, put in the detention center of the airport, kept there for 15 hours, and then the next morning I was deported back to London and declared a threat to national security. Now, when the Russians turn on you, they don't tend to do so mildly. They tend to do so with extreme prejudice. And kicking me out, while terrible for my business, was not such a terrible sanction compared to what could have happened. And so I looked at my situation. I said, where am I exposed? I'm exposed in that I had a big staff of people in my office in Moscow who could be arrested. I'm exposed in that I have a big portfolio of stocks invested in Russia. And so I did an emergency evacuation of my staff and all of their dependents and brought them to the UK. And once I got everyone here, we then quickly and quietly sold every last security we had in Russia and got all of our money out. And I thought, phew, this is a big relief. I'm going to move on to other things. Maybe I'll write a book about this someday. End of the Russian story. Well, it might have been the end of the Russian story for me. It was the beginning of the Bill Browder story for them. 18 months after I was expelled, and I should point out that I did keep an office in Moscow. I prepaid an office. I had one secretary there in case the storm ever blew over. 18 months after I was expelled, 25 police officers showed up at my office in Moscow looking for all of our documents. 25 more officers showed up at the office of my law firm in Moscow. And they were looking for the stamps, seals, and certificates for our investment holding companies, which at this point were empty. They found all these documents at our law firm. They seized the documents. And then the next thing we know, we no longer own our investment holding companies, our empty investment holding companies. They had been fraudulently re-registered using the documents seized by the police. At this point, I was worried, not for financial reasons, our money was safe. I was worried for legal reasons, what the police, if they were stealing companies and doing what else they were going to do. And so I went out and hired the smartest lawyer I knew in Russia, a young man named Sergei Magnitsky, to investigate and help me figure out the whole story. Sergei goes and investigates, and he comes back and he says, I figured out what it is. First, they tried to steal your money, but that wasn't possible because you had already gotten your money out. And so the next thing they did, he said, was when we were selling everything, when we had liquidated our portfolio, we had a profit of $1 billion, and we had paid a capital gains tax bill to the Russian government of $230 million. And what Sergei had figured out was when these people had stolen our companies, they took the companies back to the tax office, and they said there was a mistake made in the previous year's tax filing. These companies didn't make $1 billion, and they came up with a convoluted scheme to try to show that. And they said, because they didn't make $1 billion, they actually made zero. Therefore, the $230 million of taxes that were paid last year were paid in error. And so they applied for a $230 million tax refund on the 23rd of December, 2007, 2 days before Christmas. It was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia. They applied for it 2 days before Christmas, and it was approved and paid out the next day. The largest tax refund in the history of Russia. This wasn't my money, this was my fund's money, this was the Russian government's money being stolen by Russian government officials. We were of the impression that Vladimir Putin is a nationalist, that maybe he is allowing foreigners to get ripped off, but how could he possibly allow his own government to be ripped off? And we figured if the information was just brought to the attention of the right people, then the good guys would get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. And so we wrote criminal complaints, I went to the police, and then Sergei went to the Russian State Investigative Committee, their version of the FBI, and gave sworn testimony against the police officers who conducted the raid. And we sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. Well, it turns out that in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. About 5 weeks after Sergei testified, the same officers he testified against came to his home at 8 in the morning, arrested him, put him in pretrial detention, where he was then tortured to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in a cell with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell. They moved him 28 times. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against the corrupt police officers. And they wanted to get him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million and he did so on my instruction. And Sergei, they figured, here's a tax lawyer, he'll buckle in a week. They had no idea that Sergei was the most principled guy that you could ever imagine. For him, the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was more awful than the physical pain they were subjecting him to, and he refused to sign this false confession. The pressure got worse and worse and worse and worse, and his health started to break down. He ended up getting terrible pains in his stomach. He ended up losing 20 kilos, and he was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. 1 week before the operation, they came to him again and said, sign this false confession. Again, he refused. And in retaliation, they moved him from a prison that had a medical facility to a maximum security prison called Butyrka, considered to be one of the most awful prisons in Russia. And most significantly for Sergei, there was no medical facilities. At Butyrka, his health went into a terrible downward spiral. He was in constant, agonizing, ear-piercing pain. He and his lawyers wrote 20 different desperate requests for medical attention to every different branch of the criminal justice system. Every different branch of the criminal justice system either ignored or denied in writing his request for medical attention. On the night of November 16, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities did not want to have responsibility for him anymore. They put him in an ambulance and sent him to a different prison that had a medical wing. When he arrived at the different prison, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell, they chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat Sergei Magnitsky to death. That was November 16th, 2009, more than 8 years ago. Sergei Magnitsky was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the news at 7:25 a.m. the next morning, and it was the most heartbreaking, traumatic, shocking news I could have ever gotten. Sergei Magnitsky was killed because he was my lawyer. If he hadn't worked for me, he'd still be alive today. And for me, that was just the most horrible thing that could have ever, I couldn't have imagined anything more horrible than that happening. And when I was finally able to get over the emotional trauma enough to be able to think clearly, it was obvious that I needed to put aside everything else I was doing, put aside all business, and I made a vow to Sergei's memory, to his family, and to myself that I was going to go after the people who killed him and make sure they faced justice if that was the last thing I ever did. And for the last 8.5 years, that's what I've been doing. I'm no longer doing business, and I've been on a campaign and a mission to get justice for Sergei. In theory, I should have been able to get justice in Russia. Sergei Magnitsky had written everything down. He wrote down 450 complaints documenting who did what to him, where, how, when, and why. And once a month or so, he would take these handwritten complaints, give them to his lawyer would file them, and I got copies. And because of that, we have the most granular record of human rights abuse that's come out of Russia in the last 35 years. And I would have thought that they would have prosecuted some people in Russia, but they didn't. Putin personally got involved in exonerating every single person who played a role in Sergei Magnitsky's murder. He even got involved in giving special promotions and state honors to some of those people. And so it became clear to me that there was no possibility of getting justice inside of Russia, so I sought justice outside of Russia. Well, how do you get justice in a situation like this? Well, I came up with a realization, which is that the people who killed him for money. They killed him for $230 million. And they don't keep that money in Russia. They keep that money in London, in Geneva, in New York. They buy houses in the south of France and in Belgravia. They send their kids to boarding school in Switzerland and in the UK. They send their girlfriends to Milan and their wives to Miami Beach. And I said to myself, if we can ban their visas and freeze their assets, then that might not be justice, but that's something that they would really be hurt by. And I took this idea to Washington, and I met with 2 senators, a Democrat from Maryland named Benjamin Cardin, and a Republican from Arizona, John McCain. And I said, can we ban the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and freeze their assets? And those 2 senators said yes. And in October of 2010, they introduced the Sergei Magnitsky Act into Congress. Moments later, their phones lit up. People started calling from all over Russia saying, you found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. Can you sanction the people who killed my mother? Can you sanction the people who killed my brother, my father, my sister? After about a dozen of these calls, these 2 senators realized they were onto something much, much bigger than one case. And they added 65 words to the law to include all other gross human rights abusers in Russia. And in November 2012, it went for a vote in the Senate. The Magnitsky Act passed 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And on December 14, 2012, President Obama signed the Magnitsky Act into law. And it turned out that we really did find Putin's Achilles heel. He got so angry that he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families because of this law. And then he did something so emotional, it was clear that we hit him right where it counts, which was that he put Sergei Magnitsky on trial. 3 years after they murdered Sergei Magnitsky, they put him on trial, the first ever dead man to go on trial in the history of Russia. I went on trial as his co-defendant. We were both found guilty. They couldn't do anything more to Sergei. They sentenced me to 9 years in absentia. Since then, we now have a number of countries that have passed Magnitsky Acts. In In December of 2016, the Estonian government passed a Magnitsky Act. In May of last year, the British government passed a Magnitsky Act. In October of last year, the Canadian government passed a Magnitsky Act. In November of last year, the Lithuanian government passed a Magnitsky Act. And 3 weeks ago, the Latvian government passed a Magnitsky Act. There's a Magnitsky Act going through the Parliament of Ukraine and South Africa at the moment, and we're lining up Australia, France, Netherlands, and Sweden this year. I'm never going to be able to recover from the burden of guilt that I have for the death of Sergei Magnitsky. For that, I'm going to have to live with for the rest of my life. But I have been able to create a legacy for Sergei Magnitsky, and a legacy which will create consequences for people who do terrible things. And the fact that there are consequences may actually prevent people in the future, in some cases, from doing terrible things, and hopefully save some people's lives. And I'm hoping that Sergei Magnitsky's sacrifice will be the savior of other people's lives through this new law named after him. Thank you very much. Happy to answer questions. Don't be shy. And can you introduce yourself when you're asking the question?
Hi. I saw you speak at Harrow School a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And what I thought was most striking, I don't know if you noticed it, because actually it was something I wanted to ask you about your opinion, was that in the front row, while you were giving a talk, were the sons of 4 Russian oligarchs. And I remember a moment when you spoke about them stealing the assets from the country. And I was so shocked, but I saw a couple of them laughing. And I don't know, did you notice that? And I wonder how that felt, speaking sort of literally in front of these people whose fathers had committed such terrible things. I don't know.
That's an interesting question. That's a new question. I get a lot of same questions when I give speeches, but I've never heard that one before. I like that. Well, I remember that night very clearly, but the only person who I noticed from the Russian oligarch community was the son of Boris Berezovsky, who had been killed, and he didn't laugh at any of that stuff because he was from the exile oligarch community. But one thing I can tell you right now is the oligarchs are not laughing. The oligarchs are very, very unhappy with what I'm doing. And there's a sort of arrogance among these people they really behaved in the most arrogant, horrible way. But all of a sudden now, their assets are being frozen. There was a list being created by the U.S. government of oligarchs. They're all running around hiring lawyers and lobbyists and trying to stay off that list. It's not a great time to be a Russian oligarch. I don't think there's ever a good time to be a Russian oligarch, but this is now a particularly bad time to be a Russian oligarch because they're all basically in the firing line. Everybody assumes that they're effectively Putin's nominees or Putin's trustees, and to the extent that Putin does worse things, their offshore assets are at risk. So I didn't actually notice those 4 guys laughing, but thank you for that question. That's interesting.
I wasn't aware of the act beforehand, but are you pushing it for lots of different countries? And if so, which is the country you want most?
That's a great question. I'll tell you the country I want most. The country I want most is France. Why France? Well, if you've ever been to Cap Ferrat, Cap d'Antibes, Saint-Tropez, or Monaco, the lingua franca, or whatever the expression is Russian. The Russians love France. They converge on France. They park their yachts in front of their villas. And to take away France from these people would be a huge, huge hit. And so France, and I didn't have any chance of getting France in the past, but all of a sudden we have Macron, who seems to be a really tough young guy, and an entirely new parliament, or almost entirely new parliament. And so France is my highest value target for the next Magnitsky Act, and I'm going to work hard to get it there. Right next to you.
Does the act prevent the families of the oligarchs also being able to travel, or is it just the oligarchs themselves?
This is a very contentious issue. Of course, there are many people, and I would put myself into this camp, who believe that it should affect family members. Because these people are ready to make lots of sacrifices for themselves, but they're not necessarily ready to make sacrifices for their families. That's the argument in favor of sanctioning the entire family. The argument against it is that no son should be held responsible for the crimes of his father. In the end, at the moment, the Magnitsky Act only applies to the specific individual. Having said that, the way it's worded in the United States and Canada is that if a person has become a beneficiary of a crime, then they are subject to sanctions. And so people often give their family members assets that they've received from these crimes, and so they could easily become entangled in this thing that route.
First time I've heard of the Magnitsky Act. About 9 months ago, the Magnitsky Act was plastered all over the American media in reference to a meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and Sofia Veselnitskaya. Are you concerned that the Trump regime, Trump administration, sorry, is so willing to get in bed with are you concerned about the future of the Magnitsky Act in Russia, considering that the Trump Jr. was willing to take a meeting on the Magnitsky Act with a Russian lobbyist?
Wow. Well, the day that I learned about that meeting, so just to bring everyone up to speed in case they don't know, on June 9th, 2016, a Russian lawyer named Natalia Veselnitskaya not Sofia, Natalia, met with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort, and asked them, if Donald Trump gets elected, will you repeal the Magnitsky Act? We don't know what the answer was, and we don't know what their counter offer was, or what the quid pro quo was. But that particular piece of news, which came out a year later in July of last year, elevated my story from a terrible sort of human rights story into the center of the biggest political scandal in American history. Do I believe that so the answer is they will not be able to repeal the Magnitsky Act because it wasn't an executive order. It wasn't done by the signature of the president. It was done by an act of Congress. And an act of Congress requires an act of Congress to repeal it, and that's not going to happen. But you've asked a more broad question, which is, do I think that the Trump regime is somehow colluding with or being nice to Russia? And I want to make point out some important distinctions and nuances here. Trump has made some extremely offensive comments supporting Putin. That I find disgusting and horrible. The people who work for Donald Trump, the defense secretary, his head of the CIA, his ambassador to the United Nations, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, are all extremely tough on Russia. Extremely tough on Russia. They're not doing any favors for Russia. And I watch it like a hawk, and there's only, so far, the situation has not gotten better for Putin. In fact, it's gotten worse. Most of the sanctions that Trump might have been hoping to repeal have now become, they had a law passed bringing those sanctions to Congress. Congress has to repeal them and that's not going to happen. There is one set of sanctions which have not been put in place so far, which is the sanctions for the hacking of the election. That's the one place where Trump hasn't acted. I think he hasn't acted because by doing so, he's so worried about the legitimacy of his own election. By acting on that somehow creates his own positive doubt about the election. But what I can say is that they put in place more Magnitsky sanctions in December last year under the Trump administration, very powerful ones with very good people on the list. They've supplied offensive weapons to the Ukrainians. And the people from, the generals are all fanning out across the world saying, ignore Donald Trump, NATO is still fine. And in fact, Donald Trump a couple of days ago said, I've been tougher on Russia than Obama. And some of you may have seen that comment. And I got called up by NBC. They said, can you come in and talk about that? And I'm not sure that Donald Trump personally has been tougher than Obama, but what I did tell NBC a couple nights ago was that it wasn't easy with Obama. Obama had something called the Russian reset, where he was trying to appease Russia. And the Magnitsky Act that we got as an act of Congress was only gotten because Congress effectively forced him to do it. And so it's a complicated game in Washington, but I don't think it's as dire the way that everyone thinks it is in terms of Trump and Russia. And I don't know whether Trump has colluded or whether he hasn't, but we'll find out soon enough from the Mueller investigation.
Thanks very much. I just wondered if you thought there was a problem with the Western stance and rhetoric towards Russia on issues like Syria and Crimea, and because what that's doing is that's uniting Russian people, very proud people, behind Putin. And so I wondered whether you thought something like more dialogue on that would mean that Russians would focus much more on the very serious corruption issues which you've talked about.
Well, I think I think the chain of logic is actually slightly different, the way I see it. The way I see the chain of logic is that Putin's primary goal was to steal as much money as possible, and I estimate his net worth at $200 billion through all these schemes that I've just discussed, including the Magnitsky crime. He's been stealing money from his people for 17 years. And because he's been stealing money from his people for 17 years, they don't get that money, he does. And what don't they get their money for? They don't get money for health care, so people are dying younger. People aren't getting money for schools, they're not being educated. Everybody's corrupted every step of the thing. You get harassed by police officers demanding bribes. Everything is a disaster for people in Russia, and they're angry. And so there was a time when people's lives were getting better in Russia, when the oil price was rising. Now they're not. And he's stealing the money, and they're not seeing it, and they're angry. Now, what does someone do if you're running a country for 17 years? People don't get to run countries for 17. People get tired, even if you've been doing a good job for 17 years, and you've got nothing because there's holes in the roads, they're dying in the hospital. The anger will be directed towards that person, the leader of that country. And so how do you deflect that anger? In the Dictator's Handbook 101, you start a war. And the war in Ukraine is not about anything. The Ukrainians are about as similar to the Russians as any two groups of people can be. It was a fake war. They ran a fake news 24-hour-a-day propaganda show on television on every station saying that the Ukrainians were Nazis and fascists. They were going to be eating Russian babies, Russian-speaking babies. We need to go in and protect our Russian brothers in Ukraine. And they created a complete fake war, wag the dog, in order to deflect people's anger inside of Russia and go after the Ukrainians. And that's what this is all about. And he started this war. He started this war in Ukraine for that purpose. All of this stuff in Syria is for that purpose. This is not about geopolitics. This is about staying in power, which is his one and only primary goal.
Hi, I've got two questions. Firstly, there was a lot of discussion about, obviously, your lawyer and his kind of sad fate. And you said he left behind a wife and 2 children, I believe. So my first question was, do you know, how are they doing? I assume, as someone who cared deeply about him, you may have kind of been able to kind of offer them some protection, because I assume there may have been repercussions for them. And then secondly, is it true that you have been accused by Putin of multiple murders and other crimes?
Yeah, so let's start with the family first. Thankfully, Sergei's widow and children are here in the UK. She sits with me in my office. She works on the campaign for justice for Sergei Magnitsky. I support the family, and they're safe. The second thing is that Putin has gotten so angry with me because of these Magnitsky Acts that first they sentenced me to 9 years in absentia. They just finished a case in December last year and sentenced me to another 9 years, so I'm now sentenced to 18 years. There's a multiple serial murder case opened up against me in Russia right now, and one of the murders they're accusing me of is murdering Sergei Magnitsky. They've accused me of being a CIA agent to bring down Russia. There are literally dozens of, there are probably 250 people inside the apparatus of the Russian government working on trying to destroy my life one way or another right now.
Thank you, Bill. My name is Stephen Bailey. I work for a public international law boutique firm in London that was founded by a former general counsel of Interpol. I'm conscious that Russia continually tried to use Interpol's channels in order to impact your life. And I was wondering whether you've ever considered legal action against Interpol for being complicit with Russia.
So Interpol, Russia has gone to Interpol 6 times since 2013 to try to have me arrested on either what's called an Interpol Red Notice, which is an international arrest warrant, or an Interpol Diffusion Notice, which is a similar type of thing. Interpol, in theory, is an organization that has a constitution which says it shouldn't be abused by member states for political, religious, or ethnic reasons. And Interpol has, in my case, upheld that constitution, and every time Russia has gone to Interpol within a certain period of time, they've overturned the Russian requests. But that doesn't mean that they haven't actually entered the Interpol system for some period of time. Interpol also has a charter with all of its members that makes them immune from any type of legal liability. There's no court in the world that will take on an Interpol case. And I would like to try to get Russia removed from the Interpol Red Notice system until they prove that they don't abuse it. And there are other countries in addition to Russia that do this. Interpol has gone from being a crime-fighting organization to being an organization that tracks down the victims of criminals. And by doing so, it also ruins, it's like a public swimming pool where if somebody goes to the bathroom in the swimming pool, then nobody wants to swim there anymore. And that's a very bad thing.
I had two questions. The first, I was curious if you have seen the people who have been subject to sanctions evading sanctions in any way, and if you're adapting to how they might try to evade by moving assets, etc. And the second question, I've read your book, so I know a bit about how it has affected your life, and obviously you don't have a red notice issued, so you can travel, but there are any other ways that the encroaching Putin has affected you?
Yes, so on your first question, yes, these people, this is all very Darwinistic. You put out sanctions and then they figure out a way of adapting. And there's one character in this whole story, his name is Dmitry Kluyev. Dmitry Kluyev is head of the Kluyev organized crime group, and he was one of the masterminds to organize this whole tax rebate fraud and so on. And he knew that we were going to come for him when this whole thing happened. And so about a year before the Magnitsky Act came into place, he transferred all of his assets to 2 nominees. And so I'm working with the U.S. Treasury to make sure that those guys get sanctioned as well. He shouldn't be allowed to do that. In terms of Interpol and other things, the Russians don't just stop with Interpol. They've applied to the British government 12 times for my extradition and mutual legal assistance. And they're constantly poking around, trying to find weaknesses in the system. So Cyprus, for example, is a place where we had our investment holding companies to invest in Russia. And Cyprus is like open for business for Russia. And so the Cypriot police, together with the Russian police, raided my Cyprus law firm, the Cyprus law firm we used 2 years ago as part of a Russian criminal case. And we're now taking the Cyprus government to court because they tried to come back again and we got an injunction against them. Just on Monday of this week, I was in Geneva. I was giving a speech at the UN, at a human rights conference at the UN. And as I was leaving Geneva airport, my passport was flagged from a mutual assistance request from Russia. And they detained me for a short period of time and asked me a bunch of questions that the Russians have been trying to get answers to. The Swiss police cooperated with the Russians. And so they're everywhere messing with me. It's not easy.
Wait, can you hear me?
Yep.
You seem to be quite successful at navigating complex political environments. If the outcome of Magnitsky had not been so dire, would you have considered investing in China, for example? And do you think you would have been successful, or do you think that would have been a different environment completely?
Well, I mean, if Sergei Magnitsky hadn't been killed, all sorts of things would be different in my life. But he has been, and the most important thing I would say that I've learned from this whole experience is that rule of law and property rights are absolutely, infinitely valuable, and without them, I really would never want to be involved. And so I don't have any money in places like China, because no matter how good the economic situation is, if some guy more powerful than you wants to take away your stuff, you have no recourse. And how do you calibrate that? How do you handicap whether someone's going to do that to you? And there are people it's kind of a real roll the dice type of situation. And people say, well, if you have the right partners, well, I've seen that in Russia. People had the right partners until they became the wrong partners, and then all of a sudden their lives are turned upside down. So, I mean, I'm in a different phase of my life where I'm no longer an investor, but a human rights activist. But if I was an investor, I would be focusing on places where I could look at economics and not at arbitrary, who knows who, to figure out how you're going to be able to hold on to your stuff that you think you have. Okay, well, there's one more question in the back. That'll be the last question.
This might sound like very thinly cached career advice, and it is. But obviously you have a background in business, you have a business degree, and now you're an activist. Do you have any advice for those of us who are also pursuing a path in business but want to also do good? Where are there areas that you see a need for those skills, and how can they be used for doing good by others as well as one's own self?
Well, my feeling on the subject, and this is maybe just sort of self-reinforcing, is it's kind of hard to do. It's hard to maximize both in the same exercise. If you're maximizing profit, it's very difficult to maximize good. And so I would argue that you should spend the first half of your life making money, and then spend the next half of your life doing good, and focus on it cleanly, because it just creates a conflict to try to do both in the same job. And Warren Buffett, he doesn't do philanthropy out of Berkshire Hathaway, but then he gave away half of his shares of Berkshire Hathaway or whatever to Bill Gates' foundation. I think you have to be I think you have to be true to whatever your mission is, and try to do as best you can in your mission, and then find another mission. And life is long, hopefully, for all of us, and you have plenty of time to do both if you do it. But you'll be more effective if you just focus on what you're focusing on than trying to do both at the same time. It's been a great discussion, good questions. I always enjoy smart questions, and you all have had them, so thank you very much, and great to meet you.
Thank you very much to everyone who came this evening.